Hi there. Now here's a topic that is not often revised very well by students, but it's increasingly important. So let's spend a few minutes thinking about monopsony power and economic welfare. So first of all, what do we mean by monopsony power? Well, it's when a business has buying or bargaining power in one or more of their markets. And this means that a business can exploit that bargaining power with a supplier to negotiate better prices for their inputs. The reduced cost of buying those inputs might in theory increase profit margins and could also affect the price. So it's an example of monopsony. Now this monopsony can happen both in product markets, where for example you're buying raw materials and component parts. It also happens of course in the labour market. You may well have studied that, where firms have buying power when they're hiring labour. So supermarkets, they have significant monopsony power when they're buying supplies from manufacturers and from farmers and growers. The National Health Service is a major purchaser of pharmaceuticals and other medical products. The energy generators buy a lot of inputs and they have buying power. So too British Sugar, which I think buys the absolute bulk of the sugar beet crop in the UK each year. You'll be familiar with Amazon, of course. Amazon has huge monopoly and monopsony power. They have the whip hand when it comes to negotiations when they're deciding what percentage they take from sales on their sales platforms. And big food manufacturers, the businesses that make millions of ready meals and biscuits and cakes and things and cereals, those big food manufacturers, they have monopsony power when they're buying their inputs. So make sure you have a couple of good examples in your revision notes. Now here's the analysis. So how might monopsony power affect price and cost? Well, I'm going to assume here for simplicity's sake that the marginal cost of supply is equal to the average cost. In other words, I'm going to draw a perfectly elastic supply curve shown there in orange. All that means is I've dropped the assumption of diminishing returns. I'm assuming that this firm can supply at constant cost per unit. So a profit maximising firm will produce an output of Q1, charge a unit price of P1, and they can make a tidy profit shown by the shaded area there. Now, monopsony power, as a firm scales up production, can be a very significant economy of scale. So monopsony power might be used to bring down the average and the marginal cost for a business because they're getting a much better price from their suppliers. If that happens, MC1 shifts down to MC2 and AC goes with it. As a result, the monopsony is able to increase their output and bring the price down from P1 to P2, and as a result this leads to a higher profit maximising output, lower price, and increases total supernormal profits. So this diagram is a superb one to use if you want to show the analysis of what might happen with monopsony. Higher prices even though they're charging lower prices. And of course if prices are lower because of monopsony power, then you move down the demand curve and there's an increase in consumer surplus. So in theory, monopsony power can be an enhancing factor when it comes to economic welfare. You might buy something more cheaply on Amazon, for example, because they've got that genuine buying power when they're sourcing their books, their DVDs, their films, and every other item under the sun. So in terms of potential benefits for consumers might gain from lower prices. Supermarkets can get better prices from manufacturers. And if those are passed on to the consumer, and the key word there is if, in whole or in part, then that increases real incomes and consumer surplus. In government monopsonies, such as the NHS, that huge buying of vaccines and other medicines and medical equipment can be used to negotiate better deals, which can benefit society as a whole. The NHS can get more bangs for its buck from its budget. On the other hand, monopsony can be damaging to consumer welfare. So to evaluate, if suppliers are squeezed too hard on price, a farmer, for example, or grower, they may cut corners, reduce investment, or in fact exit the market, harming product quality and innovation. And if some suppliers leave the market, consumers will be faced with less choice and higher prices. So there's also the risk of supply chain disruptions, as we've seen in the pandemic. And in the labour market, and that's a separate video, monopsony employers might use their buying power to drive wages down, which then negatively affects the real incomes of people employed. So on the one hand, monopsony power has the potential to increase consumer welfare through lower prices, but we do have to think about the consequences for the profits and sustainability of growers and suppliers, and also for workers in labour markets where there's big monopsony power. Please do make sure you've covered monopsony for your exams. It's a key topic, it's on the spec, and examiners like to test this area of the economic syllabus. Thanks for joining in.